In the pyramid are enshrined some of the central concerns of their culture. Concerns shared by all civilizations, even by the modern West. But no civilization held them for longer or more tenaciously than the ancient Egyptians.
Over the last 20 years, we in the Western world have become painfully aware of how our well-being is inextricably bound up with that of nature. And that understanding has given us a fresh insight into the psychology of Egyptian civilization, their attitude to religious cult, to rulership, to the afterlife, and to the idea of the unchanging stability of the cosmos. And what more dramatic illustration can there be in the whole world than the Great Pyramid, and this room in particular, of the human yearning for immutability, for the human concern for life after death. And the fact that this place has the power to move us so much after so many millennia, whatever culture we come from, is a testimony surely not only to its grandeur of conception and execution, marvelous as that is, but also to the fact that we still share the impulse which lies behind it. And in that sense, we of the late 20th century, for all our modernity, are still Bronze Age people.
Since ancient times, the Egyptians have experienced so many changes, above all in the triumph of Islam, that they might appear now to be cut off forever from the age of the pharaohs. But perhaps there is a deeper sense in which a society's ideals are passed on, a habit of civilization. Do you really believe, wrote the novelist Tawfiq al-Hakim, that the thousands of years that make up Egypt's past could have vanished without trace, as if in a dream? The Nile, said the great Arab traveller Ibn Battuta, surpasses all the rivers of the world in sweetness of taste, in length of course and utility. The civilization of Egypt, like those of Iraq, India and China, drew its life from a river. But this was a country like no other. Running for 600 miles between dunes and cliffs, a narrow ribbon of blue water and green fields, on average only 6 miles wide. This geography shaped the civilization. Where the spirit of Iraq was pessimistic, here when the Nile flooded each year, as the ancients said, the fields laugh, men's faces light up, and God rejoices in his heart. From the life-renewing soil left by the inundation, the Egyptians drew a cheerful confidence in humanity, in the permanence and stability of things. Theirs was an optimistic civilization. Their civilization grew out of a long prehistory of culture in the Nile Valley. The coming together of many small egalitarian farming communities. Communities sustained as today by hard-working peasantry, tilling the soil, creating an elaborate filigree of ditches and dikes to capture the annual flood. The Aswan High Dam, built in 1970, may have changed this age-old rhythm, but today's Egypt still depends on the tillers, the fellahin, and what the ancients called the Black Earth. Not long before 3000 BC, these local cultures were unified into a single state, the first in history. And here at the very beginning, there are clues which will determine the shape of Egyptian civilization, right down to the Islamic period. Our search begins in an obscure little village in Upper Egypt called Qom el Ahmar, the Red Mound. This was the center of a prehistoric tribal kingdom, shrine of a local divinity called Horus, the hawk. Hence its Greek name, Hierakonpolis, Hawk Town.
This is the old kingdom town.
In 1897, two British archaeologists, Quibell and Green, came here looking for the origins of Egypt.
About 20 years ago, the Americans came back to the same place.
In a field beyond the village, they made a stunning discovery, a heap of ceremonial pallets and mace heads from the ritual stores of Egypt's first kings. Kings called cobra, catfish, scorpion, hawk.
So the old kingdom temple is this whole area here, the temple of Horus.
Yeah.
Is that right? Didn't Egypt begin here? The first kings, I think.
أول ملك هو وجد هنا في القوم الأحمر. Very old area.
Did any of their fathers work on those excavations?
أباتكم كانوا شغالين معهم. Yes.
أيوه.
Among the finds was perhaps the most significant object ever dug up in Egypt. A slab of black slate 2 feet long, cut with scenes commemorating the deeds of a king called Narmer, whom legend said was the unifier of Egypt. Here is the very moment of Narmer's triumph. Wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, he dashes out the brains of the captive king of the Delta. Headless enemies lie in rows before the standards of Horus the Hawk. And already a superhuman aura surrounds the king himself, an aura of divinity.
90 years on, it's very difficult to see any trace of those momentous discoveries here in the area where the pallets and the mace heads were found. But a year later, Green made an equally intriguing find in the same area. He came across the remains of a large circular mound of clean white sand, about 50 yards across and 8 feet high, enclosed by a sloping sandstone revetment. There was evidence of a walkway leading to some central feature. Green thought the dating was prehistoric, before the first kings of dynastic Egypt, and he interpreted the mound as being a symbolic representation of the mound of creation itself, the first island which had risen out of the seas of chaos at the beginning of time, and on which the first life had landed, the hawk.
The divine kingship of Horus would last as long as ancient Egypt itself. Here in the great temple at Edfu, that same creation myth would be expounded in loving detail for colonial Greek overlords, nearly 3 millennia after Narmer's day. It was at the heart of the Egyptian conception of civilization.
Every Egyptian temple, then, was a symbolic representation of that original mound of creation, with that simple reed shrine surrounding the perch on which the hawk had landed, which was created at Hierakonpolis. And no matter how big the temples became in later ages, the Holy of Holies was still that simple reed shrine, depicted here at Edfu 3,000 years later. You can make out the line of reeds surrounding the chamber in which the image of the hawk was kept. The temple was not only, though, a depiction of the first place, but of the first time, the time when the pattern of a stable society was handed down to humankind, of kingship, law, religion, and ritual, a pattern which it was believed would suffice for eternity as long as the rituals were correctly performed. The universe then and civil society were conceived of as static. Progress, change, new questions, new answers were not required because they were not needed. And indeed, they wouldn't be needed until Alexander the Great conquered Egypt 3 millennia later.
For the Egyptians, then, divine kingship was the guarantee of a stable cosmos. The same idea can be traced across the world, from Shang, China to Aztec, Mexico. And here at Abydos, those first kings of Egypt were buried with immense brick mortuary temples, like earthly palaces. And so the key themes of Egyptian history were laid down. Centralized power, royal rituals, and the cult of the dead intertwined to form the ideology of the world's first state. Themes still potent, even in our own day. Moving northwards along the Nile, the narrow valley meets the green expanse of the delta. At this strategic point, close by today's capital, Cairo, the Horus kings built their royal city, Memphis. On the sandstone escarpment above the floodplain is the great funeral complex of the Third Dynasty kings. Here at Saqqara, the mud brick architecture of Abydos was turned into stone. An immense 200-foot-high tomb of King Jose, the first of the pyramids. In a handful of generations, around 2500 BC, a series of gifted kings, Huni, Senefru, Khufu, Khafre, building bigger and bigger as each seems to try to outdo his predecessor, created the greatest series of funeral monuments the world has ever seen. The most famous, the Giza pyramids, are now all but engulfed by the suburbs of Cairo, stripped of their polished limestone casing and plundered for building stone, but still awesome. There are many myths surrounding the building of the pyramids. The Hollywood epic version had slave gangs whipped along by tyrannical masters. But Egypt was not a slave society. The mass of the workforce was not enslaved. In a long reign, it was perfectly possible for a government to mobilize huge-scale state employment to build such monuments, using the workforce in the wet season, when the Nile flood left idle hands.
In the quarries, we could get some idea of the character of the gangs who built these pyramids. The tough gang, the boys who stay forever, Khufu's boys. But exactly how it was done, there's very little evidence for. They must have worked from an enormous ramp running from the river, with feeder supports of wood and earth, perhaps, to bring the stones round.